Every major decision that affected your life this year, the price of your rent, the cost of your groceries, the company that got the government contract, the regulation that didn't pass, someone knew it was coming before it happened, not because they predicted it, because they were in the room where it was decided. And the room? You've never heard of it. You were never supposed to. Please subscribe and activate the button to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can bring you more relevant content and so YouTube can notify you when we publish new videos. Let's establish something immediately. The game being played at the highest levels of global wealth is not the one being described in the press, not in business news, not in the kind of documentary that gets greenlit, distributed, and placed in front of a mass audience by the same conglomerates it would need to honestly investigate. The narrative you've been given, that markets are competitive, that merit determines outcomes, that the playing field is imperfect but broadly accessible, that narrative is not a lie exactly. It's something more insidious than a lie. It's a partial truth, weaponized. The visible economy is real. Companies do compete. Entrepreneurs do build things from nothing. Hard work does produce outcomes that wouldn't have existed otherwise. All of that is true for the layer of the economy most people inhabit. But underneath that layer, threaded through it, shaping it from below, there is a different set of dynamics operating by entirely different rules. And the people running those dynamics have a very specific interest in making sure the partial truth stays loud enough to drown out the full picture. Here's the most important thing to understand before we go any further. This is not about villains. The framing of evil billionaires pulling levers in secret rooms makes for compelling social media content and very little actual understanding. The people inside these structures are not uniquely immoral. Many of them are thoughtful, educated, occasionally generous, and genuinely convinced that what they're doing is either neutral or beneficial. The system doesn't require malice. It runs on incentive, on logic, on the perfectly rational behavior of individuals who are simply playing the game they were handed with the tools available to them, which makes it considerably harder to dismantle than any conspiracy would be. Conspiracies have participants who know they're conspiring. What we're describing has participants who largely believe they're doing what anyone in their position would do. The fact that their position was inherited, architecturally reinforced over generations, and structurally insulated from the kind of competition they publicly champion, that's not something they necessarily spend a lot of time examining. The game is hidden not because someone decided to hide it. It's hidden because the people playing it don't need to announce their moves. The moves happen inside structures that are legal, normalized, and largely invisible to anyone not already operating at that altitude. Let me give you the clearest possible picture of what altitude looks like. There are approximately 3,000 people on the planet who could make a phone call tomorrow morning and, within 48 hours, have a substantive meeting with a sitting head of state in any G20 country they chose. Not because they have political influence in the crude sense, not because they donated to a campaign or hold a formal title, but because the governments of the world have learned, over decades, that these individuals have resources, networks, and informational access that are genuinely useful in ways that no diplomatic service can fully replicate. Governments need to know what's actually happening in markets before the data shows up in official reports. They need to understand which technologies are about to shift competitive dynamics between nations. They need quiet intermediaries for conversations that can't happen through official channels. The people we're describing are all of that, simultaneously, across multiple jurisdictions, with no term limits and no election cycle. They are permanent. That permanence is the first real advantage. Politicians cycle, bureaucracies turn over, regulations change. But a family that has been placing capital, building relationships, and accumulating informational leverage across a sector for 70 years has an institutional memory that no government agency and no publicly traded corporation can match. They remember the last time this pattern appeared. They remember who behaved well under pressure and who didn't. They remember which promises were kept and which were restructured into something unrecognizable. Memory at that scale is a form of power that doesn't appear in any financial statement. And the reason most people never see the game being played is not because they lack intelligence. It's because the game was specifically designed to be legible only at close range. You need to be inside a certain proximity, socially, informationally, financially, before the structure becomes visible. From the outside, what you see is the surface, the brand, the philanthropy, the curated public presence. The surface is the distraction. There's a concept in elite social circles that almost never gets named explicitly but governs almost everything: The people inside it don't have a single term for it. Some call it positioning, some call it access maintenance, some don't call it anything because they've never needed to explain it to anyone who didn't already understand. It works like this. At a certain level of wealth and influence, the most valuable thing you can hold is not an asset. It's a relationship, but not a relationship in any ordinary sense. Not a friendship, not even a partnership exactly. It's a specific, carefully calibrated state of mutual relevance. You are relevant to me because of what you know, what you control, and who listens to you. I am relevant to you for the same reasons. We are not friends. We are something more durable and more useful than friends. We are people who have made ourselves genuinely difficult to replace in each other's world. Building those relationships takes time that most people dramatically underestimate. The first meeting is nothing. The second is a test. The third is where something real begins to form if both parties have passed the test without knowing they were being tested. And the test is never what you'd expect. It's not about competence. Competence is assumed at this level. You don't get into the room without competence. The test is about something subtler. How do you handle information you weren't supposed to receive? Do you use it immediately, loudly, in ways that benefit you at the expense of the relationship? Or do you file it away, protect it, demonstrate through your restraint that you understand the actual value of being trusted? The ones who pass that test are invited deeper. The ones who fail don't get a second test. They just stop being called. This is how elite networks self-select. Not through formal criteria. Through demonstrated behavior under conditions most people never realize were evaluative. It's an entrance exam with no announcement, no application, and no feedback when you fail. You simply notice, gradually, that the invitations stopped coming. Now layer that social architecture with something equally invisible but far more consequential: information asymmetry. The financial world runs on the assumption that markets are, in some meaningful sense, efficient, that publicly available information is priced in quickly, and that sustained advantage requires either superior analysis or better execution. That's roughly true for the retail investor operating in public markets. It is almost completely irrelevant to the people we're discussing. At the level of dynastic wealth and institutional power, the real advantage isn't better analysis of public information. It's access to information that isn't public. Not illegal insider trading in the textbook sense, though that exists too, and is considerably harder to prosecute at this scale than most people realize. The deeper advantage is structural. It's sitting on the board of a company in one sector while holding a significant stake in a company in a related sector and understanding, from both vantage points simultaneously, what's about to shift before anyone outside either boardroom has the faintest indication. That's not a crime, it's a position. One that took years, possibly decades, of deliberate relationship building and capital deployment to achieve. And once achieved, it compounds. Each additional board seat, each additional investment, each additional relationship with someone in a regulatory body or a government ministry adds another node to the network, another source of early information, another relationship that makes you harder to ignore. The network becomes the moat. And when the network is wide enough and deep enough, something genuinely strange happens. You stop needing to actively seek information. It comes to you, because you have positioned yourself at enough intersections in enough systems that significant developments tend to cross your desk as a matter of course. Sometimes weeks before they're public. Sometimes in a form so early that even the people creating the development don't fully understand its implications yet. There's a particular type of investor, rare, patient, almost pathologically long-term in their thinking, who has cultivated this state deliberately. They don't chase opportunities, they don't react to markets. They've engineered a position from which opportunities surface naturally, predictably, and at a frequency that looks, from the outside, like extraordinary luck. It isn't luck, it's what happens when you've spent 30 years making yourself genuinely useful to people who have no shortage of options. When you've been consistently discreet, consistently reliable, and consistently present at the right moments without ever being so present that your agenda becomes obvious. The best players in this game are almost completely invisible. Not because they're hiding, because they've made visibility unnecessary. At some point in the last 40 years, something shifted in the way elite power projected itself publicly. The shift was gradual enough that most people didn't register it as a strategic decision, but it was the old model of visible power, the industrialist with his name on the factory, the newspaper baron who made no secret of his politics, the dynastic patriarch whose portrait hung in boardrooms across 3 countries. That model had a structural weakness. Visibility creates targets. Targets attract scrutiny. Scrutiny, in a world with investigative journalists, and eventually the internet, creates accountability. Not always, not consistently, but often enough to be inconvenient. So power moved, not to secrecy exactly, to something more nuanced. Call it curated ambiguity. The new model doesn't hide, it obscures through volume, through the proliferation of foundations with beautiful names and well-photographed initiatives, through media presences carefully calibrated to project warmth, intellectual curiosity, and a form of responsibility that gestures toward accountability without actually submitting to it, through the strategic deployment of philanthropy not as charity, which implies giving something away, but as an extension of influence into sectors that would otherwise be difficult to access. The philanthropist who funds universities gets to shape what those universities research, who they hire, which ideas get institutional legitimacy and resources. The foundation that funds public health policy in developing countries gets to define the terms of the conversation in rooms where it has no formal democratic standing. The tech billionaire who launches an initiative to reform education gets to position himself as a visionary reformer rather than someone whose business model depends on a specific kind of human that a reformed education system would conveniently produce. None of this is illegal. All of it is influence. And the brands. This is where the visible economy and the invisible one intersect most cleanly and most cynically. The luxury brand is not primarily a product business. It is a hierarchy management system. What it produces, the bags, the watches, the clothing, the champagne is almost secondary to what it actually sells, which is a position in a social architecture. The object is the proof of purchase. What you've actually purchased is a signal readable by a specific audience that places you inside or outside a boundary they care about. The genius of the system, and it is genuinely genius in a cold, clinical sense, is that the boundary is always managed, never fully permeable, never fully closed, because a luxury brand that becomes too accessible loses its signal value, and a brand that becomes too exclusive loses its revenue base and, eventually, its cultural relevance. The art is in the calibration, releasing exactly enough product to grow revenue while restricting enough to maintain the perception of scarcity. Cultivating a public conversation about exclusivity, how long the waitlist is, how difficult the access, because that conversation is itself the advertising. The people waiting are doing the brand's marketing, voluntarily, at their own emotional expense. And the brand, meanwhile, isn't just selling objects. It's providing the ultra-wealthy with a refined instrument for social communication. A Patek Philippe on the wrist of someone who doesn't need to wear a watch to tell the time is saying something specific to a specific audience in a language that most people around them can't hear. It's a transmission on a frequency only certain receivers are tuned to. And the brand built that frequency deliberately, maintained it, protected it with the same ferocity a government protects a classified communication system. What makes this whole structure particularly durable is the way it recruits aspirants. The person who saves for 2 years to buy an entry-level luxury item isn't outside the system, they're its most loyal ambassadors. They've internalized the hierarchy so completely that they're now spending real, significant resources to signal proximity to a group that barely registers their existence. And they'll defend the system, psychologically, because to stop believing in it would require confronting the cost they've already paid. The luxury brand doesn't need enforcement, it has believers. And at the top of that pyramid, the families and structures we've been discussing aren't buying the products. They're owning the companies that make them. They're not aspirants, they're not even just consumers, they're architects of the aspiration itself. They built the language that everyone else is now trying to speak. Which raises something I want you to sit with going into the second half of this. If you can engineer the desire, if you can make millions of people want something badly enough that they'll restructure their spending, their social behavior, their self-perception around acquiring it, what else can you engineer that same way? Because what comes next is not about brands or acquisitions or boardrooms. It's about something older and less discussed, the mechanism that makes all of it sustainable across generations, the thing the global elite does with politics, with culture, and with the way people understand their own ambitions. And it's far more elegant than anything we've covered so far. Here's the reversal. Everything we've described, the opacity, the information asymmetry, the brand architectures, the social networks that self-select through invisible tests, all of it requires one thing to function at full power across generations. Not capital, not intelligence, not even the right legal structures, though those matter. It requires narrative control. The most sophisticated thing the global elite does is not financial. It's epistemic. It shapes what people believe is possible, what they believe is normal, and most critically, what they believe is worth wanting. And it does this not through censorship, which is crude, visible, and ultimately fragile, but through something far more effective, through the curation of aspiration itself. Think about how the culture around wealth has shifted in the last 30 years. The 1990s gave us a particular version of the aspirational story: the self-made entrepreneur, the garage startup, the meritocratic miracle. Silicon Valley exported that narrative globally, and it took hold with extraordinary force. Not because some of it was true, but because it was so thoroughly useful. It reframed the structure of wealth as something you could build from nothing if you were smart enough and worked hard enough. Which meant that the concentration of wealth at the top wasn't a structural problem, it was just the scoreboard. The people already at the top didn't resist that narrative. They funded it, they celebrated it, they gave TED Talks about it. Because a world that believes in meritocratic ascent is a world that doesn't systematically examine whether the ladder reaches the ceiling. It just tries harder to climb. The shift to celebrating the entrepreneur was, among other things, an extraordinarily effective misdirection. While the conversation was about Elon and Jeff and Mark and their origin stories, their garages, their dorm rooms, their slightly mythologized journeys from nothing to everything, the actual architecture of multi-generational concentrated wealth was doing what it always does, quietly, without press releases, without anyone asking why the same four families still control the same industries their grandparents built, just with different logos. New wealth is loud. Old wealth is silent. And silence, in a media environment that runs on noise, is the most effective form of invisibility. Now here's the part that requires genuine precision to understand, because it's easy to get this wrong. Old money doesn't resent new money, it uses it. The tech billionaire who makes headlines is, from the perspective of a dynastic family with 4 generations of capital behind it, a useful distraction, and sometimes a useful partner. The new capital brings energy, public legitimacy, political access to a different generation of politicians, and occasionally genuinely new ideas that the older structures have calcified against. The integration of new wealth into old structures is one of the least discussed, but most consequential processes in modern capitalism. It doesn't happen through acquisition, it happens through social architecture. The new billionaire gets introduced to the right people at the right events, subtly assessed, tested, in the way we described earlier. And if they pass, if they demonstrate the right combination of capability, discretion, and long-term orientation, they get invited deeper, not into some formal council, into a gradually more central position within the relational networks, where things actually get decided. Some of them take the invitation without fully understanding what they're accepting. What they're accepting is a set of unspoken norms, priorities, constraints that come with proximity to that level of concentrated influence. You don't announce certain things. You don't associate publicly with certain people. You manage your public positions on sensitive political topics in ways that preserve optionality across administrations and ideologies. You don't compete against the structure in ways that would require the structure to defend itself against you. In exchange, you get access that money alone cannot buy. Information flow, introductions that open doors faster than any amount of capital could. A form of institutional trust that is, at this level, the most valuable currency on earth. It's not a Faustian bargain, not quite. The constraint is real, but so is the value. The people who navigate it successfully are often those who genuinely don't experience it as constraint, because by the time they're inside it, their values and the system's requirements have been so thoroughly aligned through years of social proximity that there's nothing left to resist. That alignment is the system's masterpiece. Not the money, not the brands, not even the networks. The masterpiece is the human being who no longer needs to be controlled because they've come to want exactly what the structure needs them to want. So what do you do with all of this? Not in the activist sense, not the political sense, something more personal and more immediate than either of those. You've now seen the outline of how the game operates, the layers, the mechanisms, the way aspiration is engineered and narrative is managed and access is granted and withheld as instruments of influence. You've seen that the power at the top isn't held through force, or even primarily through money. It's held through the coordinated behavior of people who've been shaped, over years and generations, to want what the structure needs. And the temptation at this point is to feel one of two things. Either a kind of helpless rage at the unfairness of it, at the distance between the system as described and the system as publicly narrated, or a kind of cold ambition. I understand the game now, so I can play it differently, get myself closer to the center, use the knowledge as a map towards something. Both responses are understandable, neither is quite right. The rage is accurate but misdirected, because the system doesn't have a villain address. You can't protest at a building that has no name on the door. The architecture of this kind of power was specifically designed to absorb criticism, to make reformers fight against abstractions rather than identifiable targets. Every time you orient your energy toward dismantling the machine at a macro level, the machine has already moved somewhere you can't reach from where you're standing. The cold ambition is smarter, but it has a cost that most of the people who attempt it underestimate severely. Getting inside these structures requires giving something up, not once, progressively. The closer you get, the more the unspoken norms begin to shape your behavior, your associations, your public positions. And at some point, if you've been sufficiently successful at the approach, you look up and realize that the version of yourself who wanted to get inside for reasons that mattered to you, that person has been gradually replaced by someone who wants what the structure needs you to want. It's not forced, it's seductive. So the more useful response, the one that actually changes something at the only scale you can directly affect, which is your own life, and the decisions inside it, is clarity, not cynicism. Clarity is not the same as cynicism. Cynicism says nothing matters, the game is rigged, trying is pointless. That's comfortable, but it's also false. Things do matter. Individual decisions compound in the same way capital compounds. Small positional advantages built consistently over years in domains where the structural barriers are lower and the game is less completely stitched up produce outcomes that would be invisible at the start. Clarity says, I can see the game. I understand which parts of it I'm involuntarily participating in. I can make more deliberate choices about where I direct my attention, my resources, and my aspirations. I don't have to want what the brand tells me to want. I don't have to compete on the terms the system designed to keep me competing on a track that serves interests other than mine. That sounds like a small thing. It is, individually. But the architecture of elite power depends, at every level, on the coordinated behavior of people who haven't seen it clearly. The aspiration economy, the luxury signals, the status games, the performative proximity to wealth runs entirely on the participation of people who believe the signal is worth the cost. When enough people understand what the signal actually communicates and who benefits from them sending it, the dynamic shifts. Not overnight, not all at once, but the system that depends on manufactured desire is brittle in exactly the places where desire is replaced by understanding. The elite don't fear reformers. They're accustomed to reformers. They've outlasted generations of them. What they're less prepared for is a broad, quiet, persistent shift in what people decide to want. What people decide is worth building, protecting, signaling, and passing on. The game was designed to be invisible so that the only people who could play it seriously were already inside it. You've just seen the board. What you do next is yours. Luxury power exists for one reason only: to reveal what the elite pay to hide. Subscribe to Luxury Power and hit the bell now. Every week a new secret is uncovered. Drop in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing our global audience. Everything you saw here is based on real cases, verified contracts, and documented facts. We don't glorify wealth, we dissect it. Do you still think money buys freedom? Tell us in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to see the truth. And remember, even the most expensive life can be a gilded cage. See you in the next video.